Okie schmoky, let's get down to business. Iron Mike's keys to the game, the keys to Super Bowl 58. We had, this is textbook, Mike gang. We'd agreed four. Obviously, a fifth comes in from Iron Mike midway through the day, but I love it. I was going to ask you
I
about.
thought we agreed five, and I
Oh
was short.
God,
I
I'm
thought I was shorting you out by only doing four.
fair point. You're all about the giving. You're all about the kindness. Iron Mike.
As is, that's
I'm going to
true.
spin off to it as usual on 8,000 tangents anyway. So who's counting, quite frankly? Let's start. Number one, and these are in no particular order. We're not power ranking them. We're just chucking them out as they come. Kansas City dominant up front, Iron Mike. The Kansas City defense, of course, has been lights out this season, particularly in the playoffs. So let's start there. What is the game plan to neutralize and keep this Kansas City front in check, do you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because Kansas City, as I said earlier, has basically changed their entire philosophy. Since that game at Christmas, they've basically run almost as many times as they've passed.
Yeah.
Mahomes has taken very few deep shots down the field. He hasn't turned the ball over as a result. And they were willing in the championship game. Pacheco averaged 2.8 per carry, but they still ran him 23, 24 times, whatever it was, to control the clock. And the question will be for San Francisco, how do you handle that offense? You know, you would think they were playing into San Francisco's hands because San Francisco's fairly strong in the middle, you know, and they've got two good linebackers most of the time. But how are you going to control Mahomes? They only had 2 sacks in their 2 playoff games, and both of them came from Nick Bosa. And, you know, we've seen when the 49ers lose a Super Bowl, it's because Mahomes is under lots of pressure and has to get away from it. But I think up front, the more pressing question is the flip-flop of that. The Kansas City has another strong interior front. And the 49ers were beaten up in the 2 playoff games up front.
Yeah.
You know, they fell behind in both games. And they have to figure out a way to control that front better than they have been doing so that their offense can function. And I can see Spags coming up with a game plan which involves run blitzing as opposed to blitzing Purdy, you know, but bringing, you saw what he did in the playoffs. He brought people from unusual angles, you know, people you don't expect to be rushing. He wasn't depending on his edge guys to do the bulk of the rush work. And Chris Jones, of course, is a monster in the middle.
Well, if you think about let's look at what they did, the game plan against the Ravens, which obviously we spoke a bit about on the pod. And just looking back at that game, watching the game film back again, breaking it down, 81 yards was all they mustered on the ground, Baltimore, which was the number one rushing offense going into that game. And Lamar they contained as well. So it was the dual effect of shutting down the running backs, but keeping Lamar in check as well. And if you break that down into even greater sample size of the playoffs, Mike, so the Finns, the Bills, and the Ravens, 41 points in total. And they were the number 3 top 6 offenses, basically 1, 6, and 4, respectively. And up against Allen, who was red hot form, led the league in total touchdowns. Lamar, of course, is going to be MVP. So when we talk about this offense balling, but this defense balling rather, and the defense in red hot form, it has been all season long, but it's got even better in the playoffs.
Yeah. And, you know, I looking at the Ravens, I think that the Ravens they thought that Kansas City was playing in run stat defenses and therefore passed again. The Ravens didn't run the ball.
Yeah.
You know, you say they stopped the Ravens running.
They didn't try to in the first half. Yeah.
First play of the game was a 10-yard run by Gus, and the next play was a 9-yard run by Hill. Yeah. And then I think they each had 3 carries on the game.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like, you know, it wasn't like they were way behind and they had to pass. I couldn't for the life of me understand that, you know. But I think that's what they were looking at. They thought passing was going to be the way to beat them. And the hidden strength of the Chiefs defense is the fact that their secondary is really good.
Mm.
And they play very aggressive coverage. And if the referees are going to give them the holding, the body contact, which they do most of the time, McDuffie is a tremendous guy. Snead is really good. Ward is really good, but he's not playing, I don't think. But they're loaded in the secondary with guys who can man cover, which gives Spags an awful lot of freedom to do the rest of the stuff up front.
But it makes this such an intriguing matchup because this is a 49ers offense that, the great Dick Vermeil described it brilliantly. There's nowhere on the field that they don't attack, is how he described it. This 49ers offense. And a lot of people have drawn the parallels with McCaffrey and Marshall Faulk, and Faulk was McCaffrey's boyhood hero. And there are obvious similarities with the way that they play and the way that they're used by their respective offenses. But that's fascinating. You're right. There's strength across all this Chiefs D. And yet the 49ers offense is geared up to look for mismatches and look for pressure points all across the field. It's fascinating, Mike. Break down how you think the 49ers will, where they'll get the most traction in terms of getting the offense going.
That's the good question. And I mean, it's not like they're going to install a lot of new stuff. The one thing I would look at, and they haven't done it, I've said this a couple of times toward the end of the season and in the playoffs, is McCaffrey lining up more at wide receiver. They got good looks when they had Juszczyk out there.
Yeah.
In the last game. I think that's one of the mix-up things. We haven't seen Debo in the backfield, but I think that was because they're still favoring his injury, and presumably in the Super Bowl that will stop. But they work really well when Debo's in the backfield too, and running the ball. So that, I think, is one thing that they will do that they haven't done in the last few weeks. And I think Debo actually is probably the key to this because he's the toughest guy to man cover. Kittle is probably the second one because they're probably going to use a safety on Kittle, I would have thought. If they zone up, that would be a big change for them. So a lot of teams will play zone because they want to crowd the middle of the field. They want to block the crossing routes, kind of like the way most teams play Kansas City, to be honest. It's a very similar construction. The one big advantage I think that the Niners have is that Kansas City are looking at 2, maybe 3 playmakers. I mean, that the defenses account for.
Right.
Kelsey, Rice, and Pacheco. And you have to keep an eye on Mahomes because he always will scramble once or twice when you're least expecting it. Whereas San Francisco, you have to account for Kittle, Debo, McCaffrey, and Ayuk.
Yeah. And now Purdy's running as well. Now Purdy's showing he can run.
And that's 4, as opposed to 3. And 4 is a lot if you're going to try to account for, and not just say, okay, you got him man for man. You might get away with it for some of the time. And I think that's kind of like the advantage that the Niners will have. But otherwise, when you look at it, the other advantage they may have is that Kansas City's tackles are crap. Not as bad as the ones when they played Tampa.